Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a second of two-part lecture series on relativism, and specifically we will be looking at cultural relativism in this lecture. So generally speaking, when we speak about relativism, we're talking about X as being relative to some Y. So the idea underlying this is that whatever X is, it is not universal. So we might talk about the idea of truth and say that truth is relative to the individual. The idea here then is that truth is not universal, that individuals have their own truths. This is a position called epistemological relativism. When we use the term epistemology, we're simply referring to theories of knowledge. And in this case, when we're talking about relativism within epistemology, we're talking about knowledge being relative to something, and here specifically truth being relative to the individual. There are some assumptions implied here, particularly when we say that X is relative to Y. We are also saying that Y cannot be judged by anyone else for holding X. So X is relative to Y means that simply we cannot judge Y for his or her beliefs. So if you know someone who is, for instance, an anti-vaxxer or someone who believes that the earth is flat, and you also are an epistemological relativist, then you cannot criticize them for holding the position that they have that the earth is flat, even if you believe that it's round and we have scientific evidence to prove so. What we want to focus on, however, is moral relativism, and the idea here that moral rules are relative to some Y. So the underlying principle here is that there are no universal moral principles, no universal moral rules, no universal moral virtues. That means then, of course, that our moral principles, rules, or virtues can differ. And they can differ along three lines: culturally, individually, or a third way that we will not talk about in these lectures is what's called student relativism, and I invite you to look up articles on that. So what I really want to focus on is the idea that moral rules are relative to either some society or some individual. In this particular lecture, we will focus on society or culture. In my previous lecture on this, we focused on ethical subjectivism, which is the idea that morality is determined by the individual. Now, another distinction that we might want to make is that between sociological and moral relativism. So the sociological as a social science is going to be descriptive. And if you've heard my lecture on what ethics is, you know that the distinction between descriptive and prescriptive, or descriptive and normative, is that in one case we're simply describing without a judgment, and in the other case we're issuing some kind of judgment. Sociology is about describing society to a great part. And so when we talk about sociological observations about cultures disagreeing over morality, we're making scientific claims. Obviously, there are differences in cultures about abortion, about the death penalty, etc. The moral cultural relativism, however, is going to be prescriptive. And here it's the idea that moral values of one culture cannot be judged by those of another. And so we have not simply a descriptive statement, but a prescription or a normative statement that something ought not to be done. Now, we want to think about some arguments for cultural relativism. And here we might think about Ruth Benedict, a famous sociologist. Her book is called Patterns of Culture. And she studied a few different peoples, the Kwaikutl of Vancouver Island and the Dobu Island people off of New Guinea. In Kwaikutl, she saw that some people in the tribe, when they died, they believed that they traveled to another tribe, or when they were killed, people would go to another tribe and kill someone there of equal rank to prevent fate from destroying the whole tribe. That is particular to their culture. We don't find something like that in other cultures, and so we have a descriptive form of relativism here. Off to Dabu Island, it's legitimate to cheat your neighbor, for instance. Colin Turnbull, a lesser-known sociologist, studied a group of people in Central Africa known as the Ik. I know people don't believe this, but you can look up Colin Turnbull and look up his findings about the ick. And in their situation, after children got to the age of 3, they were put out of the hut to fend for themselves. Adults would steal from children, etc. Obviously, something we don't do typically in the United States, and so we have differences in cultures here. Another argument that we might give for cultural relativism is the skepticism argument. And here the claim is that morality is not like science. So within science, we can discover universal moral principles like the second law of thermodynamics or the law of gravity. But within morality, we cannot discover these universal moral principles. And what sociology does, and so the argument here goes back to someone like Turnbull or someone like Benedict, to say that sociology proves that there are no universal moral principles. And further, we might also see that morality is often a way of keeping one group in power over others. So we might talk about religion here as being a way of keeping people in power over others, and that's just one form of cultural relativism. Uh, we might also claim that as cultural beings, that as beings who live in culture and who are not gods, we have no access to any kind of universal culture. So we are limited and defined by culture, and this means that even if there is a universal morality, we have no way of knowing it or accessing it. Uh, Now, I want to look at some arguments against cultural relativism. And the first one is that it is a logical contradiction here. So to claim that there is no universal moral principle seems like itself to be a universal moral principle. Or to be more specific, to say that no culture can judge another culture's morality seems itself to be a particular moral principle that we are using against every culture. And so we might ask whether this is a universal principle, whether we find it in all cultures or not. Is it something that we know through our use of reason? And so it seems like there might be a logical contradiction in saying that cultural relativism should be the way that we live our lives, because then we're making a moral judgment about people, a universal moral judgment. Another argument against cultural relativism is the idea that cultural relativism leans on heavily sociological and anthropological arguments. And so here we want to make a distinction between descriptive claims and normative claims. And we don't want to say that just because cultures do disagree about what's morally right and wrong, that they ought to, or that there's no way that we can come to some kind of agreement about what is right and what is wrong. And so we can also find instances where we might say that, in fact, we have found some universal judgments against things. If we agreed with cultural relativism, then we would have to say that the people who invaded Nazi Germany to stop the German occupation or the German killing of Jews were immoral. We'd have to say that those who fought against American slavery were immoral. And we'd have to say that those who fought against Aztec human sacrifice is immoral. So remember, when we're talking about cultural relativism, we're saying that people within that culture must live according to the rules and principles of that culture. That's what cultural relativism is. So it's cultures cannot judge each other. Within ethical subjectivism, it's people cannot judge each other. But within cultural relativism, it's the idea that cultures cannot judge each other. But if I am judging someone within my culture, then that's perfectly legitimate to do. And the other thing that cultural relativism does is it removes the human ability to evaluate moral beliefs from culture to culture, something that we know happens quite often. And so we did make judgments against Nazi Germany. We do today make judgments to say that American slavery was wrong, and we do make judgments today to say that Aztec human sacrifice was wrong. So we make moral judgments about these practices, and cultural relativism would prevent us from doing that. So what we're saying in some part is that anthropology and sociology needs to look deeper beneath the surface to discover some moral agreement. And in fact, if we look at all major religions, we see that they have some form of the golden rule. And they're stated differently, but they all come down to a basic idea of the same golden principle: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We also see that all cultures value honesty. And the question becomes not whether honesty is valuable, but who belongs or who deserves honesty within this or that culture. So when we think about disagreements within anthropology and sociology, we want to say that disagreements exist for a reason. So we have to come to understand the geography, the history, and the socioeconomic circumstances. So the Ik were suffering from famine for many generations. And so it became important to only protect those who needed protecting at a very minimum. And so it was okay to put children out of the hut when they were 3. Eskimos, we know, live in very harsh conditions, and so they often practice forms of abortion and euthanasia that we would find immoral, but that they have to do according to the conditions in which they live. We also want to be careful about making hasty comparisons between different cultures. We want to come to understand the culture rather than simply just judging it. So nothing that I say against cultural relativism means that we should just go out there and willy-nilly make judgments about other cultures that we know nothing about. That takes us, though, to the question about skepticism. How are we to understand the skepticism about coming to a universal moral norm? Well, we have to recognize that knowledge comes in many forms. Yes, there is scientific knowledge, and yes, in our own world, we typically take scientific knowledge as the only legitimate type of knowledge. But in fact, there are many more kinds of knowledge that we ought to or have in the past taken as legitimate. So presumably you know how you feel and you know your own internal thoughts. That is a form of knowledge. We also might talk about historical knowledge. How do we know that someone lost the Battle of Waterloo, who that person was? How do we know why they lost the Battle of Waterloo? These are kinds of questions we answer through history, which is not repeatable as is modern scientific knowledge. It's not something that we can experiment with. And so we would also claim with Aristotle that morality is a different kind of knowledge and should not be subjected to the same kinds of stress that scientific arguments are made. So here, when we say that skepticism prevents us from finding universal moral rules, what we're saying is that we're not looking for the same kind of scientific universal moral rules within morality. We're looking for something different. Also, simply because we have not found a universal moral agreement does not mean that one does not exist. Again, I've mentioned the golden rule, which exists in every major religion, but we can also talk about moral progress. Obviously, we no longer sacrifice virgins to the gods today. We no longer look upon slavery favorably. So we have made moral progress, and that can be just as important as having a universal moral rule. So when we think about someone like Martin Luther King Jr., we have to recognize that this person has done something to benefit society by standing against his culture and by rejecting cultural relativism and saying that there is a higher law that we have to obey. And if we accepted cultural relativism, we could never appreciate Martin Luther King Jr. as being heroic. In fact, he would be someone that we would have to argue against. In fact, what Martin Luther King Jr. does is show us that in many ways, cultural relativism protects the interest of those in power. And we see this both with slavery and with women's suffrage. And it also often justifies inaction. The United States was very slow in responding to Nazi Germany. And in terms of abortion, we see that there's a slow response here in terms of protecting others. So, what we want to do is be respectful of other cultures and recognize that cultures can change and make progress along the way, and that uh, denies the idea of cultural relativism. So, by the end of this video, you should have reasons for rejecting both ethical subjectivism and cultural relativism and you should be on your way to thinking that perhaps relativism is not the best way to think about morality.